Hey guys, Clover here. This is a video that's supposed to come out ages ago, but I finally got around to fixing the bits that broke. Today we're going to be talking about everyone who Kris is currently allianced with. Some of these are more theory than based than others, but I still think this is a very interesting topic. But before we get into that, if you could subscribe, that would mean a lot. I'm trying to get to 1,000 by the end of the summer, and any little helps. Anyway, without further ado, on to the video. To get this first one out of the way, I want to talk about the Fung gang. The Fung gang consists of Kris, Susie, and Rousey. I think this is the most obvious alliance Kris has, and even though it does appear Kris isn't fully loyal to them, they obviously do care about both Susie and Rousey. For some evidence about them caring, Susie is quite obvious. It is shown multiple times that Kris cares deeply about Susie. But the most obvious case for most characters is based on T theory. I'm sure everyone knows at this point what T theory is, but for a quick explanation, in Chapter 2, you can buy Ts that are based off of the characters in the party. Different Ts heal different characters by random amounts based on how much that character likes the character who the T is based off. For example, Noelle, when drinking the Susie tea, heals for around 500 health because Noelle has a crush on Susie. This is important because in Chapter 2, Kris heals 120 health when drinking the Susie tea, which is the most health Kris can get from a tea. If this is very obviously showing that Kris has cared about Susie from the start, and this can be explained quite easily by the fact Kris very obviously hates the fact they aren't free and hates the fact they're controlled, but Susie actually takes control away from us and does her own thing, which I think Kris enjoys and likes. As for Rousey, in Chapter 1 and 2, it's quite hinted at that Kris doesn't have the best opinions about Rousey. Kris never is shown to hate Rousey or anything even close, but they don't fully seem to care about Rousey either. This is most likely because Rousey just really wants to make the player or Kris happy and does whatever we tell them to do. And as Kris always doesn't like them controlling us, they are seeing Rousey as just feeding into us controlling them. But through Chapter 3 and 4, it does seem that Kris's opinion of Rousey does slowly change to be more positive. The biggest evidence is the fact in Chapter 4, anytime you try to say anything negative to Rousey, Kris will change the way they say it to make it positive. But also, even though the T's rot in Chapter 3 and 4, meaning you can't use them to tell how much characters like each other, in the code, it is set so after the end of Chapter 4, if you make Kris tell Rousey that it's okay not to smile, the T value for Rousey will change from 60 health when Kris drinks it, which is one of the lowest, to 100 health. This shows that at that point, Kris actually starts really caring about Rousey, even if it's nowhere near the same amount as Kris cares about Susie. So overall, it's clear that Kris very much so cares for both Rousey and Susie, and does want the best outcome for them. But that being said, this is very clearly not the only alliance they currently have, and also not the one they're doing the most for. The Knight is the next one I want to touch on. The Knight and Kris have a very interesting relationship. A lot of people have just drawn it as they are working together, but I don't know if that's true. The main evidence people use when they're working together is the fact that people think the person on the phone is the Knight. Now, I don't think this is true, because I've mentioned this before, but the person on the phone, the way they speak, but the person on the phone and the way they speak less so implies that they want the wrong to happen or the knight to win, and more so implies the fact that the soul is needed to seal the fountains, which, based on what we know, would go against the knight's goals. So I'm just gonna say that the person on the phone is not the knight. I will get to that later, because I think there's a lot more interesting stuff with the phone. But even though the phone isn't the knight, does not mean that Kris and the knight don't have any form of alliance. During the battle against the knight, Kris will do much less damage to the knight, and also when they go down, instead of swooning like Susie and Rousey, they will just go down normally, but they won't heal, which implies they're choosing not to get up. And then also, if you beat the knight, where the knight usually knocks down Susie and Rousey, they will instead make Kris kneel by almost knighting them. Obviously, all of this shows that Kris most likely is working for the knight. Also, if you get to the knight in one section, Kris will just stand there and won't attack them, and then get knocked back down. So there's multiple sections where Kris and the knight show to be on the same side. But there's one detail I think people are missing. If the knight knocks down either Susie or Rousey, Kris's damage will go back up to its normal amount, which implies that even though Kris is holding back against the knight, they still hold their alliance with Susie and Rousey above the knights. If the knight and Kris were actually working together, I don't think Kris would do this. So I instead think Kris and the knight have an understanding of each other, and they do in some way care for each other, but I don't think they're directly working for each other or with each other. I just think they have an alliance or a truce to not kill each other when they see each other. Obviously, I've gone over this a lot, but I do think Knight is Des. If you want some evidence about that, go to my holiday theory that I posted a few weeks ago. But I think the Knight is Des because of multiple themes connected to Des and the Knight, which would imply the reason that Kris is holding back on the Knight is probably because they still feel guilty for whatever happened to Des, as Kris is constantly hinted to have something to do with Des' disappearance. But that's my opinion on whether or not Kris and the Knight are working together. I don't think they exactly are working together, but I do think they have some form of truce with each other.
I win Gaster, the royal fire.
Okay, next up, this is definitely the more theorizing one, but I want to talk about Gaster, the player, and the second voice. I put these all in the same section as I think they all connect neatly together. First of all, the player and Kris clearly have some form of alliance with each other. It is a very unstable alliance. Obviously, Kris does not like us controlling them, but at the same time, Kris does seem to need to put us back in for whatever plan they have. And unless you're on the weird route, they seem to put up with you for the most part, unless you do things that are actually negative. So while it is very, very unstable and could fall apart at any moment, I do think Kris has at least some amount of understanding of the player. And at the very least, if not right now, they will at some point just have a truce with the player. Because they do need us to continue, so there is some form of truce with each other. As for Gaster, I don't know if Gaster and Kris have any direct connections, but Gaster is the one to make the soul we use to play as. And also, the second voice. If you don't know who that is, in the Goner section, where Gaster helps you create the vessel, a second voice appears, who is very clearly not Gaster, and then takes the soul and puts it in Kris. I think we have a truce of Gaster, because Gaster's the one to help us connect, the one to root us on when fighting the knight, the one to talk to us on Twitter at the end of chapter 4. So it's very clear that the player and Gaster have some connection and some form of truce going on. But the second voice, I think, has a truce with Kris, as one of the most popular theories right now is that at one point it said that Kris summoned the demon with Catty, and maybe made some deal with the demon. And I think whatever that deal was is the reason we are currently controlling Kris. And if that's the case, that would mean whatever demon it was is the person who put the soul, took it from Gaster and put it into Kris. I do have thoughts on who this demon could be. My main thought right now is that it might be Friend, because Friend is usually connected to cats, and the whole devil's tail very much so seems like a Friend thing, as cat petters, for anyone who doesn't know, does seem to be related to an old game called Cats, or I forget the name of it, but this old game where you would have a cat made out of circles, and the devil's tail on the prophecy is also made out of circles. So it seems like Kris may made a deal with Friend, or whoever the second voice is. So that means that in this truce, there is a truce between Gaster, well, there's an alliance between Gaster, the player, a truce between the player and Gaster, no, the player and Kris, a truce between, alliance between Kris and the Friend, and also the Friend is seemed to have been created by Gaster based on the name of the code. So that means there's also an alliance between Gaster and Friend, or at least a truce, which means that this is for some reason like a square of everyone having a truce with each other. Like, it's just a perfect circle where everyone has a truce with like two people, but not everyone. It's weird. This truce is one of the weirder ones in my opinion, as it doesn't even seem like the player really knows who Friend is. Doesn't seem like Kris knows who Gaster is. So nobody really knows who anyone is, and yet they all seem to have a truce with each other. But anyway, this is the more theory-based one, and the less like factual one. It's just the way I see things. Okay, next is Carol Holiday. Carol seems to have a truce with Kris, or an alliance, and based on the fact that the person on the phone says, "I'll be right there," and then Carol shows up, it does seem like Kris and Carol are the one who's talking over the phone, which means that they are the one who are actually working together. This means that Kris and Carol are the people conspiring to do whatever it is with the bunker that Carol's trying to do. This also makes sense since the person on the phone doesn't want Susie to get the guitar, and then Carol also takes the guitar. So whatever they are planning to do, it seems to at least somewhat be more powerful than Kris's alliance to Susie. That's also another reason I don't think the person on the phone is the knight or connects to the knight, as I already mentioned how Kris's alliance with Susie and Rousey seem to be stronger than their truce with the knight. While in this scenario, Kris seems to have a stronger alliance with Carol, or whoever's on the phone, as they directly go behind Susie's back to try and make sure she doesn't get the guitar, and lies to Susie, or lies to a mission to Susie about it. Also, it doesn't seem like Kris wants to have a stronger alliance with Carol than Susie, because it seems like Susie's about to go explain everything to... Oh no, it seems like Kris is about to go explain everything to Susie at the end of chapter 4. But then Carol phones Kris and reminds Kris that they made a promise. What this promise is, I'm not sure. My only guess is that it's related to death and the fact Kris has something to do with this, and it's most likely that Carol in some way is emotionally manipulating Kris into working for her because Kris feels guilty about what they did. That last bit's a bit more speculation, but I do 100% think that Kris has an alliance with Carol, and that the alliance with Carol for right now is stronger. But at some point, Kris is going to turn their backs on Carol and join up with Susie fully. But that's a smaller one. That's also quite a simple one. Okay, next up, more of the Fun Gang. I don't know if these guys count as the Fun Gang, but, you know, whatever. Okay, so Noelle and Bardley, okay, I don't really know. Noelle obviously has quite a big alliance with Kris, but Kris and Bardley are the first time we see Kris have a double alliance or triple alliance, which is exactly what we see with the rest of the game, where Kris, as I mentioned before, so far has been shown to have 3 separate alliances, which was foreshadowed in the scene where Bardley says, oh, we're gonna have to truce, Queen says we're gonna have to truce, and Noelle says we're gonna have to truce. I think Noelle represents the truce with the Fun Gang, Susie and Rousey. Bardley represents the truce with the player, because Bardley seems to usually be where we are able to control Kris against her will through either killing Bardley or asking Bardley to go to the festival. Usually any options that have the higher chance of making Kris uncomfortable is through Bardley, which is why I think that one's representing Bardley as representing the player as it. And then finally, Queen is quite clearly meant to represent Carol's alliance with Kris, as Queen is already meant to represent Carol, as in Queen represents the way Noelle's mother treats her. Also, Queen kind of represents how all the mothers treat each of the different liners, which also probably explains why Rousey usually is ignored by Queen, because Rousey probably doesn't really have a mother. But that's against the point. I think Bardley is just there, and Bardley and Noelle are just there to foreshadow the fact that Kris has multiple truces with multiple people. But I also think Noelle and Kris have a much stronger alliance in the weird route. I'm going to very briefly touch on this because I don't really know what to say about the weird route, because it is, well, it's weird and it's quite uncomfortable. But in the weird route, after you do chapter 2, it is said by Noelle that Kris, after taking the soul out, rushed over, number one, gave Bardley to the hospital, then went to Noelle, took the thorn, which is actually the thorn ring, out of her, and it explained that it was all a joke, it was all a dream. And then in chapter 4, we can undo all of that progress, which causes Kris to like really just like crash out on us, which is what I mentioned in the player one earlier. Right now, the alliance between Noelle and Kris is mainly just in the weird route, and while they do have a truce obviously in the normal route, it hasn't been touched on much since chapter 2. So I'm just going to leave it as the weird route alliance, and also, which seems to be more of an alliance between the player and Noelle at this point, and also the fact that Noelle was foreshadowing for Kris's different alliance, along with Queen and Bardley. Okay, I'm just gonna like throw some stuff out now, because there's probably a lot of different stuff that could happen. Number one, Kris probably has some form of truce or alliance with Azrael if he ever ends up coming to the Dark World. That's quite obvious. Ram seems to have a truce with Kris, or an alliance with Kris, where Ram wants Kris to feel freedom again. But in the same way that Toriel doesn't seem to understand the root of the problem, so he just tries to work around it. Then Ram and Kris also seem to have a very, very toxic alliance, where Ram, in the same way Ram does, wants Kris to have freedom, but Ram takes it in a much more violent way, as Kris has seemed to have violent tendencies in the past. Next, the Forgotten Man. Him and Kris seem to have some relationship. I don't really know what to say about the Forgotten Man, because all we really know from chapter 3 and 4 about him is that he's going to be in the field in chapter 5, and also the fact he just isn't Gaster, which was our best guess on who he was. So I honestly do not know what to say about the Mission Man, but based on the fact that he interacts with Kris in chapter 3 in such a weird way, and the fact that you are in your Lightner form for that scene, all of that is just very interesting, so I just want to mention it here. I already mentioned Friend, but if Friend isn't the second voice, there is a prophecy that says something like the devil's tail, like the tail pointed the children. I think it's the one that scrambled up. I'm trying to remember it. Hang on, let me check. Okay, so it's lost where the forests grow. Hang on. So I have like the scrambled one up right now. I couldn't find the non-scrambled one. Lost where the forests grow. Hang on. Lost where the forest would grow. The tail pointed. Oh, the children would follow the pointed tail. Which, okay, so lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail. The pointed tail is probably talking about the devil tail that is referenced in the earlier prophecy. But, that's interesting, because, as I mentioned earlier, that is most likely talking about Friend, based on Cat Petter's and Friend's connection to it. And also, Lost in the Forest Would Grow most likely talks about the bunker, because the bunker is the area that is in the forest where the forest should grow, and if Friend pointed at it and the children went there, that most likely means Kris and Des, and maybe Noelle and Azrael went there when they were younger. So it does seem that Kris and Friend have some prior relationship. Even if it's not the truth, I think it's important to bring up here. But that's, I think, all of the other, like, smaller connections I can make. But overall, that is all of the alliances I could find with Kris. If you can think of any more alliances that I didn't think of, leave a comment down below. And give me your feelings and thoughts about all of the alliances I mentioned. Do you think any of these are going to be more important in the future? Do you think some of these are wrong that I mentioned? Do you think that Kris and Noelle and Bardi were actually foreshadowing? Let me know. Anyway, without further ado, if you enjoyed it, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one, which will be tomorrow, because I have 3 videos coming out all in a row. 1 theory today, 1 theory tomorrow, and then something special on the next day. I hope you enjoy.